Turn that grill off right now, or I'm calling the fire department. Karen, it's literally just ribs. Smoke is a community violation. Yep. That's the moment I realized my summer BBQ was about to turn into a suburban war zone. Smash that like button if you've ever had a neighbor try to outlaw fresh air. Subscribe for more stories where Karens mistake backyard fun for federal crimes. Grab a plate, because this one involves a full-on neighborhood rebellion, a pack of industrial meat smokers, and one very trapped SUV. It was the kind of Saturday afternoon you picture all winter long, the kind where the sky is a perfect blue, the grill is hot, and the smell of hickory curls up into the breeze and settles across the neighborhood like an invitation. I had set out my folding chairs in the driveway, laid the ribs down with a careful hand, and already had friends gathering with cold drinks in their hands. The hiss of the meat meeting the grates was like music to my ears, and the first wisp of smoke carried the kind of comfort that only barbecue can. For about 7 minutes, it was everything summer was supposed to be. That is, until Karen appeared. She came stomping out from her house across the street, not walking so much as charging like she was heading into a battlefield. Her floral bathrobe flapped around her ankles, and her slippers slapped against the pavement with each furious step. Before I could even flip the ribs, she was shouting loud enough to rattle the windows, claiming the air was being poisoned, her garden was under attack, and that I was violating every code known to man. The way she carried on, you would think I had dragged an oil refinery into the cul-de-sac rather than a backyard smoker. Neighbors started to peek out from their blinds, some curious, some already looking resigned like they had seen this particular performance before. Karen pointed an accusatory finger at the smoke rising slowly from the grill, as if naming it the prime suspect in a community-wide crime. She waved a handful of papers that looked like they had been printed from a random corner of the internet, shouting about air quality charts and property value impacts. I stood there with a pair of tongs in one hand, watching her melt down and wondering how on earth smoke that smelled this good could be anything but a gift to the neighborhood. It might have been funny if it hadn't been so loud. Her voice carried down the block, mixing with the scent of ribs, until the entire street felt like it was divided between those enjoying the barbecue and those being force-fed her outrage. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary cookout. What had started as an afternoon of food and laughter was about to turn into a full-scale showdown, and Karen wasn't backing down until she made the smoke her enemy of the state. Before I had a chance to even settle back into the rhythm of grilling, Karen made sure everyone knew this was not going to be a passing tantrum. She marched right into the middle of my driveway like it was her courtroom and began rifling through a stack of papers she had clutched to her chest. With a dramatic flourish, she snapped one page free and started reading aloud about localized emissions and toxic particulates, words that sounded more suited to a power plant inspection than a neighborhood barbecue. The way she spoke, you would think my ribs were sending chemical clouds into the stratosphere rather than a light ribbon of smoke curling lazily toward the trees. I tried to reason with her, pointing out that every house on the street had a grill, and that half the time during summer the air smelled like burgers or steaks. None of that mattered to her. She declared that I was creating an environmental hazard, one that she claimed fell under community health regulations. I asked her where exactly she had found such rules. She lifted her chin proudly and tapped the header on her paper, which bore the unmistakable look of a website cobbled together in the early days of the internet. It had clip art, crooked graphs, and a logo that looked suspiciously like it had been stolen from a clip art gallery. The neighbors who had gathered closer began to chuckle under their breath, but Karen pushed through the laughter. She said she was documenting my violation for an official report, and then she produced her phone and started recording, narrating in a tone that suggested she was filming an episode of some investigative series. She pointed her camera at the smoke rising above the grill, zoomed in on my hands as I turned the meat, and added commentary about reckless behavior and disregard for community safety. For a moment, I just stood there in disbelief. I had been looking forward to this cookout all week, and now I was being turned into a villain on her self-produced reality show. My friends whispered behind me, wondering if she was serious or just bored, but I already knew the answer. Karen wasn't putting on a performance for a laugh. She believed in every word she was spewing, convinced that my simple Saturday gathering was a threat to the order of the neighborhood. The longer she stood, waving those pages and shouting about air quality, the more it became clear. She was not going to stop until someone either took her seriously or outlasted her. By the time Karen had moved from waving papers to waving her phone, Her voice had reached a pitch that felt like it could shatter glass. It wasn't just the shouting, it was the way she projected every word with the confidence of someone delivering a State of the Union address. She wasn't talking to me anymore. She was talking to the entire street, and she wanted every window cracked open and every neighbor within earshot to know exactly how evil my smoker was. Her words bounced off garage doors and echoed down the cul-de-sac, mixing with the lazy hum of lawnmowers and the clatter of kids' bikes on the pavement. Suddenly, it was less a barbecue and more a stage for her one-woman protest. She pointed at the thin gray plume rising from the ribs like it was the exhaust pipe of a factory, crying out that smoke particles were microscopic daggers tearing through everyone's lungs. She said property values were already in free fall, that realtors were probably weeping somewhere because of my decision to cook ribs. She shouted about secondhand smoke, as if brisket had become the new pack of cigarettes. By then, the absurdity was so thick you could taste it right alongside the barbecue. Behind her, blinds shifted and curtains twitched as neighbors peeked out with expressions that ranged from annoyance to amusement. A few came out onto their porches with folded arms, half expecting a fight, half expecting entertainment. My friends were frozen in place with plates in their hands, whispering jokes about needing popcorn because this was better than anything on television. Karen's performance had pulled in her audience, and she thrived on it. Every hornet nest needs spectators, and she had them. I tried to keep my calm, flipping ribs as if nothing was happening, but the way her voice cut through the afternoon made it impossible to ignore. Every sentence was sharper than the last, rising higher, building momentum, until the whole block was wrapped up in her fury. It was the shriek heard around the block, not because it mattered, but because it was impossible not to hear. What struck me most was how quickly she had turned smoke from a background detail into the central villain of the day. She wasn't just complaining anymore, she was declaring war. When the shouting alone failed to shut down the grill, Karen took things to the next level. She pulled out her phone with the authority of a detective making an arrest and dialed 911 right there in front of everyone. I could hear her giving the operator a dramatic report, describing a dangerous fire situation and uncontrolled emissions. She made it sound like I had a forest blaze raging in the driveway instead of a rack of ribs slowly cooking over charcoal. My friends exchanged looks of disbelief, some stifling laughter, others whispering that surely the dispatcher would see through it. Still, within 15 minutes the sound of a patrol car drifted down the street. The flashing lights bounced off garage doors as the cruiser pulled up. The officer stepped out with the weary patience of someone who had probably dealt with this caller more than once. Karen immediately rushed over to him, waving her papers and pointing at the faint trail of smoke curling lazily into the air. She spoke rapidly, insisting that the community was in grave danger and that property was at risk. She even gestured toward my friends, accusing them of participating in what she called a reckless gathering. The officer walked over to the grill with a kind of calm that only made her angrier. He bent slightly, inspected the coals, glanced at the ribs, and then looked at me with the faintest trace of a smile. He asked if I had enough food for everyone. The laughter from my friends broke loose, spilling into the street, and Karen's face went bright red. She tried again, shouting that he wasn't taking the issue seriously, that he was ignoring a blatant violation of environmental codes. The officer let her finish, then said he saw nothing illegal about a neighbor cooking dinner. Karen stomped her foot, clutching her clipboard to her chest like it was her shield, and demanded he take action. The officer shook his head, reminded her that wasting emergency services on personal disputes could have consequences, and returned to his car. For a moment, silence settled across the block. The grill sizzled, the ribs smoked gently, and the crowd that had gathered seemed to collectively exhale. Karen, however, was far from finished. I could see it in her narrowed eyes. She wasn't going to let a plate of ribs defeat her authority, not while she still had schemes left to play. The officer lingered by his patrol car for a moment, leaning against the door as if he needed a second to decide whether to laugh or sigh. He looked back at Karen, then at me, then at the grill, and the whole scene must have felt like a joke that had written itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that tired rhythm of someone who had explained the same thing too many times before. He said, smoke from a backyard barbecue was not a crime, and that unless I had somehow managed to light the neighbor's garage on fire, there was nothing for him to enforce. The way he said it, flat and unbothered, sent a ripple of amusement through the crowd that had gathered to watch. Karen, though, was not amused. She tried to recover, insisting that smoke was a health crisis, and that his refusal to act would set a dangerous precedent. The officer tilted his head, squinting at her like he was trying to process whether she truly believed her own words or was just too stubborn to admit defeat. Then, almost casually, he glanced at the grill again and asked if I had an extra plate. My friends burst out laughing, the sound ringing down the street like a victory bell, while Karen shrieked that this was outrageous, that law enforcement was supposed to protect citizens, not indulge in toxic meat parties. The officer didn't bother engaging with her rant. He gave me a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said he had seen enough. He told us all to enjoy the rest of the afternoon and reminded Karen that police lines were not meant for neighborhood squabbles. Then he climbed back into his cruiser, turned off the flashing lights, and drove away, leaving behind the faint smell of exhaust mingling with hickory smoke. Karen stood frozen for a few seconds, clutching her clipboard like it was the last piece of authority she had left. The look on her face was part disbelief, part fury, the kind of expression that only deepened when she realized everyone else was laughing. In that moment, I thought she might retreat and lick her wounds. Instead, she spun on her heel, stormed back toward her house, and muttered loud enough for half the street to hear that this was far from over. Karen did not disappear into her house to cool off. Instead, she returned minutes later, carrying a thick binder tucked under her arm like it was some kind of sacred text. She slapped it down on the hood of her SUV, flipped it open, and began presenting what she proudly called her Neighborhood Authority Guidebook. The pages were filled with printouts from websites, homemade charts, and hand-drawn maps of the block, with little red circles around every house she had deemed high risk. She tapped her pen against my property on the map and announced to anyone who would listen that this was a clear violation of her air quality standards. It became obvious that she had been building this binder for quite some time. There were tabs labeled with categories like noise, grass height, paint color, and what she referred to as emissions control. She had written notes in the margins about which houses had left trash bins out too long, which ones watered their lawns on the wrong days, and which families grilled too often. It was an entire fantasy government, crafted and maintained by Karen, where she ruled as judge and jury. The funniest part was the letterhead she had designed, a logo at the top of each page that said Residential Air Quality and Standards Committee. She delivered the title with such conviction that a few neighbors actually blinked in confusion before realizing the committee only existed in cons of her head. When she began reading aloud from a page marked Violations, I caught sight of several neighbors shaking their heads, muttering under their breath about how far she had taken things. Still, Karen pressed on, rattling off codes and figures as though she were standing in front of a city council meeting. She accused me of reckless disregard for community health, citing made-up sections that sounded official only because she recited them with such fire. The binder was her shield, her evidence, her claim to power, and she held it like a weapon. In that moment, I understood she wasn't just reacting to the smell of barbecue. She had been preparing for this confrontation, waiting for the chance to unveil her playbook and assert her control. This wasn't about ribs anymore. This was about Karen proving to the neighborhood that she was the authority no one had asked for, and as the smoke drifted gently upward, she was determined to make the battle over it the centerpiece of her crusade. As Karen continued her tirade, with the binder spread wide across her SUV, the neighborhood began to divide itself in ways I had never seen before. Some people stayed tucked behind their curtains, watching the scene with the quiet fascination of people glued to a soap opera. Others stepped out onto porches and lawns, clearly tired of her shouting but unwilling to miss what had turned into the day's main entertainment. My friends clustered closer to the grill, shaking their heads and cracking jokes under their breath, while Karen's voice rose and fell like she was conducting a courtroom trial. A few neighbors drifted toward her, nodding politely, though it was clear most of them were only humoring her out of habit. These were the folks who had been on the receiving end of her complaints before, and you could see the fatigue written on their faces. One older couple leaned against their mailbox, whispering to each other about how many times she had tried to find them for lawn ornaments. Another family brought out lawn chairs and set them up at the edge of their driveway like they were waiting for fireworks. On my side of the driveway, the smell of ribs worked its quiet magic. My friends piled plates with sides, cracked open bottles, and let the food and laughter carry them through the noise. The ridiculousness of the situation became part of the entertainment, and the longer it went on, the clearer the lines became. On one side stood Karen, binder in hand, claiming smoke was the end of civilized living. On the other side stood everyone else, eating, laughing, and treating the event like a spontaneous block party. What surprised me most was the way new alliances formed, right there in the street. Neighbors who had never spoken much to one another found themselves bonding over their shared frustration with Karen's endless authority games. A father from 2 houses down leaned over the grill, complimented the ribs, and muttered that he had been waiting years for someone to stand up to her. Another woman offered to bring out her cooler of lemonade, saying that if Karen was going to stage a spectacle, they might as well enjoy themselves while it lasted. The block had been tense for weeks because of her constant surveillance and complaints, but in that smoky afternoon, something shifted. People were choosing sides, and Karen's voice, once enough to intimidate, was now being drowned out by laughter, clinking cups, and the sound of neighbors realizing they were stronger together. When Karen realized that her binder and her booming voice were not commanding the attention she expected, her entire posture shifted. She snapped the binder shut with a loud clap, tucked it under her arm, and stomped toward her SUV with the fury of someone convinced she had been deeply wronged. Her slippers slapped against the pavement with every step, and she muttered a steady stream of threats about contacting officials who would actually listen to her. It was clear she believed that the local police officer's dismissal had been a personal betrayal, and now she was determined to escalate. The way she yanked open her car door made it obvious she was not just leaving to calm down. She was gearing up for her next strike. She tossed her binder onto the passenger seat, pulled out her phone, and started hammering her screen with the kind of speed that only comes from pure outrage. Between furious taps, she shouted about city ordinances, environmental codes, and public safety violations. She announced to anyone within earshot that she was driving straight to City Hall to demand a full-scale investigation into what she called a smoke crisis. Her SUV sat gleaming in the sun, spotless as always, the chrome reflecting the grill smoke that curled lazily across the driveway. She climbed inside and slammed the door, gripping the wheel with both hands like she was preparing for a high-speed getaway. Neighbors stopped what they were doing to watch, some laughing, some shaking their heads. The absurdity of the moment was undeniable. Karen, dressed in her floral robe and house slippers, was staging an escape as though she had been chased from her own kingdom. I stood with tongs in my hand, ribs sizzling behind me, watching her back out slowly. She paused halfway, rolled down her window, and yelled that this neighborhood would regret ignoring her warnings. Her voice cracked with fury, echoing off the houses as if she were announcing the end of days. Then she shifted into drive, tires crunching on the pavement, clearly intending to speed off in search of someone willing to indulge her campaign. For a brief second, I thought she might actually vanish down the road, leaving the smell of barbecue behind her. What none of us realized at that moment was that her attempt to flee would spark the most ridiculous plan of the entire day. As Karen's SUV idled at the edge of the cul-de-sac, there was a collective pause, the kind of silence that settles in right before something truly absurd happens. My friends stood around the grill, half amused and half annoyed, and I could feel the tension humming in the air like the low vibration of a bass line. Karen had thrown her tantrum, called the police, waved her binder, and now she was preparing to make her grand exit toward City Hall. That was when Dave, standing beside me with a plate of ribs in one hand and a mischievous grin on his face, leaned closer and spoke just loud enough for the group to hear. "What if we just outsmoked her?" The words landed like a spark in dry grass. Heads turned almost in unison, and then the laughter started. It wasn't mocking laughter, but the kind that bubbles up when an idea is so ridiculous that it immediately feels perfect. The thought of surrounding her SUV with enough grills and smokers to drown out her complaints was both theatrical and oddly satisfying. My first instinct was to shake my head, to wave it off as a joke, but then I caught the look on the faces around me. This was no longer just a cookout. It had become a showdown, and Dave's suggestion had given everyone a strategy. Neighbors who had been lingering on porches perked up. Someone shouted from across the street that they had an old smoker in the shed. Another offered a pellet grill that hadn't been used in years. People began trading glances, nodding as though they were preparing for a neighborhood project rather than a prank. Even the kids, who had been running around with sparklers and soccer balls, stopped and whispered excitedly about turning the street into a smoke-filled carnival. I could feel my own grin forming despite myself. The thought of Karen returning with some official complaint only to find herself surrounded by a wall of hickory and mesquite, was too good to ignore. Dave slapped me on the back and said it would be poetic justice, payback for every ridiculous accusation and every dramatic outburst. In that moment, with ribs sizzling, laughter growing, and Karen's SUV still rumbling like a trapped animal, the plan took hold. We were going to smoke her out, not with anger, but with the one thing she hated most, the smell of barbecue. Once the idea took root, the energy of the restanted ever six block shifted from quiet amusement to full-blown collaboration. It was as if Dave had flipped a switch, and suddenly the cul-de-sac felt like a festival preparing to open. People hurried back into garages and sheds, returning with every piece of cooking equipment they could dig up. One neighbor rolled out an offset smoker that looked like it had survived 3 decades of family reunions. Another dragged over a rusted barrel grill with wheels that squeaked in protest. Someone else shouted that they had a shiny new pellet grill, and within minutes it was being wheeled down the driveway like a prized float in a parade. The collection of gear grew so quickly that I found myself laughing just watching it pile up. Old grills with missing knobs, smokers patched with aluminum foil, even a small hibachi grill someone had dug out of storage were added to the lineup. Kids darted between the equipment carrying bags of charcoal, while adults set down coolers filled with wood chips and lighter fluid. The block had never worked together like this for yard sales or holiday decorations, but the promise of outsmoking Karen had united them with a kind of gleeful purpose. By the time the sun slid lower in the sky, the sound of lids clanging and charcoal rattling filled the air. People positioned the smokers in a loose circle, forming what looked like an outdoor kitchen on steroids. Someone joked that we could have opened a roadside restaurant right there in the cul-de-sac. Another neighbor set up a folding table covered with foil pans, sauces, and trays of meat that seemed to appear from every household. What struck me most was the way everyone seemed energized by the absurdity. Folks who barely waved at each other on ordinary days were now trading recipes and tips. Arguments over charcoal versus pellets turned into laughter, and stories about family cookouts poured out as naturally as the smoke that was already starting to rise. Standing in the middle of it all, I realized this had become more than a prank. It was a statement, a collective decision that Karen's endless control would not rule the neighborhood. Surrounded by grills, friends, and the rising haze of wood smoke, I felt the sense of unity settle in. Karen's SUV had become the center of a circle, and every neighbor was eager to light the match. By the time every smoker and grill had been rolled into position, the cul-de-sac looked less like a quiet suburban street and more like the staging ground for a food festival. Karen's SUV, still parked with the engine humming, sat in the center of it all like a gleaming white monument to her stubbornness. The chrome sparkled in the late afternoon sun, but the shine only made it more of a target. My neighbors, energized by the absurdity of the plan, began arranging their equipment in a half-circle that quickly closed until her vehicle was surrounded on every side. The placement was deliberate, as if everyone had rehearsed this without ever speaking about it. The big offset smoker took one corner, its iron door already rattling with heat. The pellet grill stood tall on another side, humming softly as it came alive. Smaller grills filled in the gaps, creating a wall of lids and vents. Even the little hibachi was tucked near the front bumper, its coals glowing with the determination of something far larger. It was comical and intimidating at the same time, a barricade built entirely out of neighborhood pride and stubborn defiance. Karen sat behind the wheel, her hands gripping it tightly as if she could will the whole setup to vanish. Her face appeared in the driver's side window, pale and wide-eyed, but she refused to step out. She leaned forward, glaring at the grills as if her sheer disdain could douse the fires before they lit. A few neighbors chuckled, and someone muttered that she had wanted a show of authority, so here it was. As the last smoker was shoved into place, the air grew thick with anticipation. The block had transformed into an arena, and the SUV was the centerpiece. People stood around their equipment with tools in hand, checking vents, arranging wood chips, and making sure their machines were ready to roar to life. The mood was half playful, half revolutionary, like we were about to break some unspoken suburban law but couldn't care less. In that moment, the line was drawn. Karen's car was no longer just a vehicle, it was the symbol of her endless crusade, and the neighborhood had encircled it with fire and smoke. The only question left was how long it would take before she realized she had finally lost control. The first plume of smoke rose slowly, drifting upward in a lazy spiral before the breeze carried it across the circle. One smoker rumbled to life, then another, until the sound of crackling wood and sizzling fat blended into a chorus that filled the cul-de-sac. Hickory sent its sharp, earthy scent into the air. Mesquite followed with a deeper, richer tone, while applewood added a sweet note that wrapped around everything else. The neighborhood smelled less like a suburban street and more like a full-scale smokehouse. The grills and smokers, lined shoulder to shoulder, created a rolling cloud that expanded with every passing minute. At first it hovered just above the equipment like a mist, but soon it thickened and stretched across the circle, weaving around Karen's SUV. The white paint of her vehicle began to blur, swallowed piece by piece until only the faint shape of her headlights could be seen through the haze. Her windshield wipers flicked on in a desperate attempt to clear what was never on the glass, just in the air. Neighbors stood at their posts, tending their equipment with the pride of pitmasters. One man fanned his coals with a piece of cardboard, sending sparks upward in a glowing shower. Another basted chicken wings, letting the excess drip into the fire so the smoke hissed louder. Children danced at the edges of the fog, giggling, as they disappeared for a second and reappeared like characters in some magical story. From inside, the SUV came muffled sounds of protest. Karen's outline moved back and forth in the driver's seat, as if she was pacing within the confines of her own car. Every so often, her horn blared, a sharp note swallowed almost instantly by the hum of grills and the laughter of the crowd. Her once commanding voice had been reduced to a faint echo behind rolled-up windows, trapped in a cocoon of barbecue haze. The smoke no longer drifted gently. It billowed with purpose, rolling in thick waves that blanketed the car and seeped outward toward the sidewalks. It was not chaotic, but steady, almost ceremonial, as though the neighborhood had agreed on this form of justice without ever needing to say it aloud. The SUV, once her stage for threats, had become the centerpiece of a smoky carnival that she could neither silence nor escape. The first honk shattered the rhythm of sizzling meat and laughing neighbors. It was loud and long, the kind of horn blast that makes you think someone is about to back into traffic. Except Karen wasn't moving at all. Her SUV sat locked in the center of the smoky circle, headlights glowing faintly through the haze like tired eyes straining to see. The second honk came even faster, sharper this time, and it carried the unmistakable edge of panic. Everyone turned toward the car, as if it were a stage performance. The sound echoed off the garages and bounced back through the fog, creating a strange rhythm with the hiss of burning wood. A few kids cupped their ears but still giggled at the drama. The adults, on the other hand, exchanged amused looks. They knew exactly what this was. Karen was trying to claw back control, and the horn had become her last weapon. The noise grew frantic. Short bursts, then long blasts, each one accompanied by the faint shape of her arms waving behind the windshield. The SUV rocked slightly as she shifted in her seat, slamming her hands on the steering wheel and jerking the gear shift forward, only to find grills hemming her in at every angle. Each attempt at escape ended with her headlights bouncing off a steel smoker or a wall of smoke so thick she dared not press forward. Rather than intimidate, the honking became part of the entertainment. Someone clapped in time with the blasts. Another raised a rib bone like a conductor's baton, pretending to direct the chaotic symphony. Laughter spilled across the cul-de-sac, mixing with the scents of applewood and mesquite, until the panic inside that SUV felt almost cartoonish. From her window came the muffled shape of her voice, though the words were lost in the thick fog and the rumble of coals. She leaned on the horn again, desperate, furious, but the sound only drew more cheers from the crowd. The street had chosen sides, and no amount of honking could drown out the fact that she was completely surrounded. What began as her escape plan had turned into a public spectacle, and every frantic blast from her horn only proved how trapped she really was. As the horn blasts lost their power to startle, the rest of the street seemed to relax into something that felt more like a neighborhood festival than a standoff. The smell of meat thickened in the air until it was impossible not to get hungry. Plates began appearing in every direction. Someone laid out foil trays of ribs, another neighbor passed around burgers hot off the grate, and kids balanced paper cups of lemonade as they darted between adults. What had started as chaos was transforming into the most spontaneous block party anyone could remember. The laughter grew louder than the sound of Karen's horn. Families pulled out lawn chairs and set them up at the edge of the smoky circle, as if reserving seats for a parade. Music drifted out of an open garage, a scratchy country tune that mixed with the crackle of fire and the clinking of soda cans. The smoke that had once been a source of argument now carried with it a kind of unity, a shared purpose that made strangers feel like teammates. Even people who usually kept to themselves stepped out to take part. A neighbor from down the street walked over with a tray of cornbread, while another set up a cooler filled with drinks. A teenager offered to run a delivery line, carrying plates from one side of the circle to the other so no one had to step too close to the SUV. The more food that was passed around, the more the atmosphere shifted from confrontation to celebration. Karen's car, barely visible in the haze, had become more of a backdrop than a threat. Her muffled shouts and frantic horn taps were little more than background noise, drowned out by the cheer of clinking cups and the chatter of neighbors who had never shared this kind of joy before. For years she had sown division with her complaints and her rules, but now her protests were fueling the biggest show of unity the street had seen. I stood at the grill watching it unfold, ribs sizzling behind me, and realized the truth. She had tried to stop a simple cookout, but in doing so, she had given the block something it had been missing: a reason to gather, a reason to laugh, and a reason to finally ignore the noise of her authority. Just when it seemed the evening had settled into a rhythm of food, laughter, and smoke, Karen lowered her window a few inches and thrust her phone out like it was a distress beacon. Her voice carried faintly through the haze, strained and furious, declaring that she was contacting the Environmental Crimes Unit. The words made the crowd pause for half a beat before dissolving into murmurs and chuckles. Nobody had ever heard of such a department, and it sounded more like a phrase lifted from a late-night crime drama than a real agency. Still, Karen delivered the announcement with absolute conviction. She pressed the phone tight against her ear, nodding as if she were speaking to someone important, and began repeating phrases about toxic emissions and community safety. Every sentence was spoken loudly enough for the entire street to hear. Her performance was meant to scare us into submission, to convince us that a team of inspectors would soon storm the cul-de-sac with hazmat suits and citation books. The neighbors, however, treated her call like another act in a play. Someone raised a toast in her direction, muttering that, if an environmental crimes unit existed, maybe they could finally do something about the skunk family under their shed. Another neighbor laughed that if she wanted an investigation, the only thing they would find was the best barbecue party of the summer. Even the children, who had been playing tag near the sidewalk, joined in by chanting "Smoke Squad" like it was the name of a superhero team. Karen's frustration grew more visible with each passing moment. Her free hand pounded the dashboard, and her voice rose in pitch as if volume could transform her invented agency into reality. The SUV rocked slightly as she leaned across the seats, gesturing wildly into the phone. But the longer she kept up the act, the clearer it became to everyone else that there was no one on the other end who could rescue her from this smoky spectacle. The air continued to thicken with the aroma of wood and sizzling meat, wrapping around her SUV like a curtain. Her call, meant to terrify, had become little more than background comedy for a gathering that refused to be broken. Instead of silencing the neighborhood, she had given it another reason to laugh together, another layer of absurdity to fold into the story they would tell for years. The low rumble of an engine announced his return before the flashing lights curved into view. The same patrol car rolled slowly down the block, headlights cutting through the haze of mesquite and hickory. Neighbors stepped back slightly, some expecting the party to be broken up, others bracing for another lecture. When the cruiser stopped and the window slid down, the officer's face appeared with a look that could only be described as tired amusement. He had clearly drawn the short straw by being sent back to the same address twice in one afternoon. Karen sprang into action the second she saw him, practically leaping from her SUV in a cloud of smoke. Her voice rose again, carrying across the cul-de-sac as she pointed at the grills. She accused the entire neighborhood of creating a health hazard, claimed the air was unbreathable, and waved her phone like it was evidence. She even called the gathering a coordinated attack designed to intimidate her. The officer listened with folded arms, his expression calm, but his eyes wandered toward the tables piled high with ribs and wings. When she finally paused to take a breath, he asked the group if anyone had started a fire outside of normal cooking. A few chuckles broke out, and someone held up a plate with a slab of brisket. The officer shook his head slowly, muttered that it smelled better than anything he had eaten all week, and stepped closer to the grill. Karen's protests grew louder, but her words were drowned by the hiss of fat dripping onto coals and the cheer of neighbors handing the officer a plate. He accepted it with a small nod, clearly signaling he had no interest in escalating the situation. The sight of him taking a bite of barbecue while Karen sputtered in disbelief was almost too perfect. Her face turned red, her hands flailed, and she accused him of siding with criminals. He ignored the outburst, chewing thoughtfully before telling her in a steady tone that cooking meat outdoors was not against the law. The crowd laughed openly, the tension dissolved, and the officer walked back to his car with his plate. Karen stood frozen in the smoke, defeated by the very authority she had tried to summon. The neighborhood had won another round, not with anger, but with ribs. The moment Karen realized the officer, we had no intention of siding with her, she threw open her SUV door and stepped out into the smoky air. She coughed dramatically, waving her hands in front of her face as if she were choking on a chemical spill rather than the aroma of barbecue. Her slippers slapped against the pavement as she staggered in circles, declaring that she could hardly breathe and that the neighborhood was deliberately endangering her health. Every motion she made was exaggerated, from the way she hunched her shoulders to the way she dragged her feet, and it looked more like a stage performance than a genuine struggle. The neighbors watched in silence at first, unsure whether to laugh or roll their eyes. Then someone near the grill muttered that if she hated the smell so much, she might want to stop standing in the thickest part of the smoke. That comment broke the tension, and laughter rippled through the crowd. Karen snapped her head toward the sound, her face red from more than just the heat. She pointed her finger at the group, shouting that they would regret mocking her and that she was gathering evidence for legal action. Her words carried less force than before. Every cough, every gagging sound, every accusation dissolved into the haze of applewood and mesquite. Children darted past her with plates of food, weaving in and out of the smoke as if it were a game. Parents called out for them to be careful, their voices cheerful and unconcerned, and the normal rhythm of a neighborhood gathering swallowed Karen's theatrics whole. She tried once more to rally attention by dropping to one knee and clutching her chest. Gasps did come from the crowd, but they were followed by chuckles when she paused mid-swoon to adjust her robe. Her act was crumbling. She was no longer the stern enforcer of rules, but a figure lost in her own drama, overshadowed by the smell of ribs and the laughter of neighbors who had grown tired of her games. When she finally stood again, shoulders squared and eyes narrowed, the smoke curled around her like a curtain. Her meltdown had failed to silence the party. If anything, it had given the neighborhood one more reason to laugh, one more memory to fold into the legend of the smokiest showdown the block had ever seen. The officer, plate in hand and clearly unimpressed with Karen's dramatics, returned to the center of the commotion and raised his voice just enough to cut through the laughter. He told her, calmly but firmly, that grilling was not a violation of any code he could enforce. He pointed out that smoke rising from barbecue pits was not considered a crime in the eyes of the city, and that unless she could produce a statute forbidding ribs, his hands were tied. His tone carried no malice, only the weary authority of someone tired of being pulled into neighborhood squabbles. Karen's jaw dropped. She waved her arms in outrage, binder clutched tight against her chest, and demanded he recognize the emergency she had reported. She argued that smoke was an assault on her property and that every resident standing near a grill was complicit. The officer listened with the patience of a man who had heard it all before, then shook his head slowly. He repeated that no crime had been committed and advised her, once again, to stop misusing emergency lines. The crowd erupted with applause, the sound rolling across the cul-de-sac louder than her horn had ever been. Someone cheered that dinner had just been legally certified, while another raised a plate like a trophy. Even children joined in, clapping and laughing as Karen's fury grew redder by the second. For the first time all day, she looked less like a commander and more like a cornered performer, her audience no longer afraid of her authority. The officer handed back his empty plate with a small smile, complimented the ribs, and walked toward his cruiser. He gave the group a nod before leaving, his expression saying more than words could. Karen, still planted in the smoke, stomped her foot in frustration, but the message was clear. The law was not on her side. As the taillights of the patrol car disappeared down the street, the laughter swelled again. Neighbors toasted with their drinks, the grills hissed as more meat hit the flames, and the smoky air carried the feeling of victory. Karen had tried to bring down the cookout with the weight of official power, but the final word from the officer had made the truth undeniable. The ribs stayed, the smoke stayed, and so did the joy that filled the block. The moment that sealed the day came almost by accident. One neighbor had been filming from their porch, capturing the scene as Karen screamed into the smoky air, binder in one hand and finger wagging in the other. The camera caught her at the exact second she threw her head back and shouted that this was nothing less than an environmental attack. The phrase, absurd and grand, echoed across the cul-de-sac just as she spun around in a dramatic flourish. That spin brought her straight into the garden hose coiled across her driveway. Her foot tangled, her arms pinwheeled, and the binder flew open, scattering papers into the smoke. The hose rolled beneath her slippers, and in an instant she was down on the pavement, still shouting even as her robe twisted awkwardly around her legs. Gasps shot through the crowd, quickly followed by laughter that grew louder with every second she remained sprawled among her papers. Her horn blasts and binder lectures had not made her the star of the afternoon, but that fall did. Phones appeared from every angle. Someone zoomed in as she scrambled to collect her pages, coughing and muttering about sabotage. Another captured her face when she noticed the neighbors clapping along to her performance. The children, barely able to contain their giggles, started chanting "Smoke Queen" in unison, and the phrase spread through the crowd like wildfire. Even the officer, who had just returned to his cruiser, shook his head with a smile as he drove off, leaving the moment to play out unchallenged. Karen's attempts to recover her dignity only made the scene funnier. Each time she bent to grab a sheet of paper, another slipped from her grasp and fluttered into the smoke like confetti. Her protests about legal violations and health crises were drowned out by the sound of laughter and the clicking of camera phones. By the time she had gathered most of her binder, the video was already making its way online, uploaded by neighbors who could not resist sharing the spectacle. That stumble transformed the confrontation. What had been tense and frustrating became something unforgettable. Karen had set out to control the neighborhood with rules and threats, but her fall had turned her into the unwilling star of a viral clip that captured exactly what she had become, a woman lost in her own smoke. The video spread faster than anyone expected. By the time the last plates of ribs were being passed around, phones buzzed with notifications. Neighbors huddled together, replaying the clip of Karen screaming about an environmental attack before tripping over her own hose. The laughter that had filled the cul-de-sac earlier now echoed online. Comments poured in from strangers who had never set foot on our street, but felt like they knew exactly what kind of neighbor she was. Within hours, the clip had crossed from private posts to public feeds, gathering millions of views and sparking a flood of memes. Karen's face, caught mid-scream with smoke curling behind her, became the centerpiece of countless jokes. Some called her the guardian of the cul-de-sac. Others crowned her the queen of smoke. A few edited the clip into mock news broadcasts, complete with scrolling headlines warning of barbecue crises. Each version was funnier than the last, and each share only fueled the storm. What had started as a small neighborhood standoff had turned into entertainment for people across the country. While the internet laughed, Karen doubled down. She posted long rants on local forums, warning that her neighbors were criminals engaged in organized harassment. She declared that the smoke was a coordinated effort to poison her, and she claimed that the fall captured on video was the result of sabotage. Her words, however, found little sympathy. Every serious post was met with screenshots of her performance and sarcastic replies that turned her anger into another round of mockery. For the rest of us, the viral attention only made the gathering feel more triumphant. Strangers messaged neighbors asking for recipes after noticing how good the food looked in the background. Local barbecue groups celebrated the scene as a symbol of community spirit. Even a nearby news station replayed the clip during a lighthearted segment, calling it the Great Smoke Standoff of the summer. Karen had wanted to control the story, but the internet had taken it from her. Her voice, once the loudest in the cul-de-sac, had been replaced by the sound of millions laughing. The smoke had drifted far beyond our block, and with it went her reputation. What she had tried to frame as a tragedy had become comedy, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. By the following week, Karen returned with a new tactic. She went door to door carrying a clipboard covered in neatly typed pages that she introduced as her petition for a smoke-free street. She knocked on each neighbor's door, rehearsing a speech about protecting public health and maintaining property values. According to her, banning barbecue equipment outright was the only way to safeguard the community. She spoke with the same stern authority she always carried, but now it came tinged with desperation, as though the viral videos had left her scrambling for a shred of control. At first, a few people humored her, listening politely while she laid out her case. They nodded as she rattled off statistics she had, clearly copied from a questionable website, but the polite nods quickly turned into thin smiles. When she finally handed over the clipboard and asked for signatures, the answer was almost always the same. Neighbors declined with an apologetic shrug, saying they enjoyed the smell of a good cookout or that they did not see a problem worth regulating. Some laughed outright, telling her that summer without barbecue was unthinkable. Word spread quickly that she was canvassing, and by the time she reached the last few houses, residents were waiting for her with rehearsed excuses. One claimed they had already signed a different petition to protect neighborhood traditions. Another asked if she intended to outlaw fireplaces and candles next. A few simply closed the door before she finished her pitch. Each rejection made her voice rise higher, her tone sharper, until her frustration was visible in the way she clutched the clipboard against her chest. By the end of the day, the petition contained exactly one signature, her own. She tried to hold it up as proof of progress, but the sight of a single name scrawled across the first line told the real story. The neighborhood had spoken, not with anger, but with silence and refusal. People were no longer intimidated by her lectures or her binders of rules. They had tasted unity during the smoky standoff, and they were not about to trade it away for another set of imaginary restrictions. That evening, grills flared to life across the block, as if to celebrate her failure. The air filled again with the scent of wood smoke and sizzling meat, and her solitary petition lay forgotten. Her attempt to legislate away barbecue had ended before it even began. In the weeks after her failed petition, something remarkable happened on the block. What began as a chaotic cookout turned confrontation had sparked an unexpected sense of togetherness. Neighbors who used to pass each other with little more than a nod began talking more often, trading recipes, and laughing about the day Karen's SUV disappeared in a wall of hickory smoke. The shared memory became a running joke, the kind that softened old grudges and made people feel like part of something larger. Out of that spirit, the idea for a neighborhood barbecue club took shape. It started small. A couple of families suggested rotating dinners, each hosting once a month, bringing out their best smoker or grill. Before long, the plan grew into a full schedule with sign-up sheets and group chats, where people argued playfully over sauces and sides. The name came quickly, too. Someone dubbed the group the Smokehouse Syndicate, and the title stuck because it carried just the right mix of humor and defiance. Everyone understood what it meant. It was a reminder that they had stood together in the face of absurdity and chosen laughter over division. The first official gathering drew nearly every household. Folding tables stretched across the cul-de-sac, piled high with ribs, chicken, brisket, and homemade pies. Kids played in the street under strings of lights, while adults swapped stories about family cookouts and childhood summers. The air buzzed with energy, not from confrontation, but from the comfort of neighbors enjoying each other's company. Karen, of course, stayed inside with her curtains pulled tight, the glow of her television flickering against the window. Her silence was louder than her shouting had ever been. The club's very existence was a challenge to her imagined authority. Every plate passed and every cheer raised felt like another reminder that she had lost her grip on the neighborhood. As the evening wore on, music drifted across the block and laughter echoed into the night. What had once been a quiet street marked by tension now felt alive. The Smokehouse Syndicate was more than a club. It was a declaration that community belonged to everyone, not to the loudest voice demanding control. And with each gathering, that message grew. Stronger, carried on the smoke that Karen had once tried to banish. Karen could not stand watching the street embrace what she had tried so hard to outlaw. Each time the Smokehouse Syndicate gathered, she peered through her blinds, the glow of grills reflecting off her windows as if mocking her. Eventually, she decided to launch her own countermeasure. One Saturday afternoon, while neighbors set up folding tables and stacked bags of charcoal, she dragged a pair of giant box fans into her yard. She positioned them at the property line, facing outward like sentries, and plugged them into a tangled mess of extension cords. When the blades roared to life, they blasted gusts of air across the sidewalk, sending dust and loose leaves scattering. As if that wasn't enough, she lined her porch with citronella candles, dozens of them, their oily flames flickering in the breeze. The smoke from the candles mixed with the sharp hum of the fans, creating a bizarre wall of scent and noise that she proudly declared an anti-smoke zone. She shouted across the street that her system was scientifically designed to push toxic particles away from her home. though the only visible result was her laundry line snapping violently in the artificial wind. It didn't take long for the setup to backfire. The fans blew harder than she expected, and her freshly washed sheets tore free of their clothespins, sailing over her fence and into the neighbor's swimming pool. A beach towel followed, landing on a floating inflatable unicorn. Laughter erupted from both yards as the bright fabric soaked through and sank beneath the water. Karen rushed to the fence, waving her arms and demanding the return of her laundry, but her neighbors were too busy fishing out wet pillowcases with pool nets to hear her anger. Meanwhile, the smoke she tried to repel drifted easily around her defenses, curling through gaps between the fans and seeping into her yard regardless. The smell of ribs and brisket wrapped around her house, mingling with the citronella in a combination that made her patio smell like a campsite gone wrong. Instead of halting the barbecue, her counterattack became part of the entertainment. Neighbors laughed each time the fans sputtered or another candle blew out, and children giggled at the sight of her sheets draped over the pool deck. Her fortress against smoke had crumbled before it even began, leaving her once again trapped in the haze of her own overreactions. The summer festival arrived with more excitement than the block had seen in years. Folding tables lined the cul-de-sac, decorated with checkered cloths and piled high with platters of food. Strings of lights crisscrossed above, casting a warm glow as the evening set in. Music played from portable speakers, children darted between chairs with sparklers, and the air carried the sweet mix of grilled corn, smoked brisket, and homemade pies. It felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a fair, alive with chatter and laughter that traveled from one end of the street to the other. Everyone knew Karen would try something. For weeks she had sulked behind her curtains, watching every cookout with narrowed eyes, but the festival was too big for her to ignore. Sure enough, as the grills roared and the crowd cheered for the pie-eating contest, she emerged from her house dressed as if preparing for battle. A gas mask covered half her face, the straps tight against her hair, and she carried her binder under one arm like a soldier clutching a shield. She marched into the middle of the street and planted herself between two tables, shouting that the festival was a violation of public health codes and that she was documenting every person who had taken part. For a moment, people fell quiet, not from fear, but from shock at the sight. The mask fogged as she shouted, her words muffled and distorted, making her sound more like a cartoon villain than an authority figure. Then, the laughter started, first from the children, who pointed and mimicked her muffled voice, then from the adults, who clapped and cheered, as though she had come in costume for their amusement. The music rose again, louder this time, drowning her out as she flipped through her binder and waved papers into the air. Neighbors passed plates around her, stepping politely to the side, as if she were nothing more than an oddly placed decoration. She spun in frustration, trying to command attention, but the festival swallowed her performance whole. 5 minutes later, she stormed off, the straps of the mask slipping as she tugged it loose. She vanished into her house without another word, leaving behind a crowd that only grew louder. The festival carried on, brighter and fuller, while her attempt at reclaiming control faded into the night like smoke dissolving into the sky. When the festival lights dimmed and the grills cooled, the block was left with more than full stomachs. It was left with a memory that tied everyone together. Karen had tried every trick she could muster, from binders and petitions to fans and gas masks, but none of it had worked. Each scheme had collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. The smoke she hated so much had become the symbol of resilience, a reminder that one neighbor's tantrum could not erase the spirit of an entire street. The lesson revealed itself slowly. People began lingering longer after gatherings, helping each other clean up and trading leftovers. Children who had once been hurried inside at the first sign of Karen's shouting now played late into the evening without fear. Families who had kept to themselves opened their doors, realizing that unity was stronger than intimidation. What was meant to divide had ended up knitting the block closer than it had ever been. Karen, meanwhile, faded further into the background. Her voice no longer carried the weight it once had. When she appeared at her mailbox, neighbors no longer avoided eye contact. Instead, they greeted her cheerfully, as if to remind her that the street had moved on without her permission. The more she scowled, the more it proved that she had lost. The power she once believed was hers alone had been replaced by laughter, shared meals, and the smoky haze of summer gatherings. For me, the ribs that day were just the beginning. What started as a simple cookout turned into a neighborhood's declaration of independence from her control. Standing by the grill, I saw more than food cooking. I saw friendships forming, old walls breaking down, and the kind of unity you cannot manufacture with rules or clipboards. The smoke carried more than flavor. It carried the spirit of people deciding, together, that they would not be ruled by fear or pettiness. In the end, the message was simple. You cannot outlaw joy, you cannot police the air, and you cannot silence a block that has found its voice in laughter and brisket. Karen tried to ban the smoke, but all she really did was give the neighborhood a reason to rise with it. And that's how a single BBQ turned into the smokiest showdown in neighborhood history. Karen thought she could call the cops on ribs, but instead, she got trapped in a mesquite-flavored fog of her own making. If you've ever had a neighbor try to ban normal human activities, hit that subscribe button. Drop your wildest Karen encounter in the comments. Trust me, it's therapeutic. Remember, life's too short to argue with someone who thinks smoke is a federal crime. Until next time, may your grills stay hot, your ribs stay tender, and your neighbors stay sane.